And never once did they make a distinction between some of the ways that things are being taught, were taught in my generation and older, which there would be a heck of a big difference versus what you're teaching now. And I suspect alrighty. I noticed this piece in Scientific American, and most of you all know I have very little respect for Scientific American at this point. And I'll be curious to hear what some of the folks in education circles on YouTube think with this. In schools, honest talk about racism can reduce discrimination. Now, this is going to be fascinating. And I'm, again, not going to read all this article because there's a couple of things that I do want to show in addition to it. New laws make it harder for teachers to discuss racism and inequality, but psychological evidence shows that conversations dispel causes of bias and distress. We're going to get into that in a minute because I don't think the authors of this article actually show that very well, to be honest. And there's also a bit of, I think, false framing as far as this article is concerned. But first off, another episode of the Rogue Journal Club is now available on Apple's Podcast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music, along with being able to access, of course, by RSS. And we got into an interesting piece that seems to... interesting, very recent article. You may have seen me tweeting about it, amongst others. This article by Herbert et al., basically arguing that censorship is okay in science, which was crazy, and that such things where in the name of inclusivity some people must be censored, or instances of consequence culture and represent a recalibration and an evolution of norms. You might have guessed that Gina and I very much disagreed with that. So it was a very interesting article. Very interesting discussion. Got into a lot of things. It's a bit longer than our normal episodes because of that. We ended up going for about 2 hours, but it's well worth it if you've got the time to listen to it. And of course, you can, if you'd prefer not to, if you'd prefer the video version will be out here in the next week or so. So back to the article in question. Let's see. Where are the Native Americans? Asked fifth grade students in an Iowa City classroom last year. There are many ways their teacher, Melanie Hester, might have answered. She could have pointed out that today Native Americans live in cities and towns across the U.S. About 20% live on reservations, and Hester could have used that to open a discussion of the U.S. government's forcible movement and isolation of tribes. Hester might also have discussed how European and American settlers brutally killed many Native Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries. Instead, she evaded the question and continued her lesson without offering historical context for her students to understand the present. Teachers across the country are avoiding explicit conversations about race, racism, and racial inequality because of a series of recent laws passed in several states. In Iowa, for example, a law prohibits teaching that suggests the U.S. is fundamentally or systematically racist or sexist. The Iowa law also specifies that any teacher must ensure that no student feels discomfort, guilt, anguish, or other form of psychological distress on account of that individual's race or sex. The laws in other states lay out similar logic. Now, if you've been following the news with this in a couple of different places, you would know these have been colloquially referred to as anti-critical race theory laws, to try and remove those things. And I'm going to say right now, this is the thing, is that they're not paying attention. The authors of this article, I don't think, are paying attention to why some of this came about. And we'll get to some examples of that in a moment, because the thing about it is, where are Native Americans now? The lesson that the teacher said there, at least from my reading of the laws, and let it be told otherwise from legal experts, because of course that's not my forte. Yeah, you could have talked about that. Where we have problems is where there are problems. Where many people have problems with the way things are being taught, or the approaches being taken to teach. Yeah, is it gets into certain things like blaming certain groups of people for things that happened hundreds of years ago that they had no control over and that they didn't cause today. And we'll get into that in a second. I will show you an example here of the problem. The legal language, for the most part, seems for the most part protective of children, but the effect is quite the opposite. The psychologists, we study how parents and teachers communicate with kids about race. We can attest to an ever-growing body of scientific evidence that suggests these laws are failing the children they purport to help. I'm not so sure these guys understand why those laws were put into place, but fine. Years of research make it evident that kids notice racial and ethnic disparities from an early age. For example, psychologists have found that kids as young as age 4 will consistently pair white children with higher wealth items, such as nice cars and bigger houses, and black children with lower wealth items, for instance, run-down cars and smaller houses. I will point out, actually, that I read through that study. It is an extremely small sample size, to be honest, from what I could tell. Let's see. In other words, very young children are aware of persistent racial disparities in wealth. See, just because they can have the association doesn't mean they necessarily... I question, do the kids have the reasoning to understand that? And I also, again, I'm doubtful of the veracity of a study like that, because at least from what I could read and finding it, and again, my article is linked off here, and of course this will be linked in the description for you. It's a small sample size, but anyway. So far, this one says, okay, study finds kids pair wealthy items with one race over another, according to their study. Okay, so you're telling me kids can perceive differences. Okay. Second, we know that when children notice differences between people or groups, they usually look for an explanation. Here, a psychological principle called inherence bias comes into play. In general, when we see someone behave in a distinctly different way from others, we assume there's something inherently different about that person. Adults often fall into this trap. If someone cuts you off on the highway, you are likely to assume that they are a bad driver, rather than assume, for instance, that they are a good driver who happens to be rushing to the hospital in an emergency. In the same way, children are more likely to attribute wealth difference between communities to the group's capabilities or intelligence rather than to something external, such as a historical advantage one group has over another. See, I'd like to see the study, actually, for that. They actually provide no studies for this particular part. They just say because inherence bias. Children often go one step further and think that groups are biologically or innately different. These groups are what psychologists call essentialist beliefs, or essentialism, because they attribute group differences to some deep underlying and often unknown essence. Okay, so there is something to talk about in this, and that is better known thing of racial essentialism, which is essentially your roots of racism, that you assign something to some characteristic or some quality or something to someone based on race. That is a bad thing. That is not something you want to foster in a child. That is not something you want to foster in adults either. And therein lies the problem, because authors here, I don't think, took a deep look at why some of these laws were founded, why some of these laws came up as a concern to address a problem that was observed in the teaching approach of dealing with racism, incorporating critical race theory in the classroom, because critical race theory is itself very essentialist. It does reinforce racial essentialism. And we'll get to that momentarily. Let's see. These tendencies toward adherence and essentialism are especially harmful when we think about the children's efforts to understand racial disparities. Okay, I want to ask a question here. You're talking about kids that are 4 to 10, maybe? Do they care to even know that? Do they care to even know that? That's the thing. Is that what they're really concerned about, thinking about that time? It's like, why do I see that? Why is that something that's all consuming to a child? That's going to be on their minds. Parents, you could weigh in on this, but my guess would be no. to be perfectly honest. Scientists agree that race is not biological and is okay. It is not inherent or innate. Instead, race is a product of social and cultural ideas that are imposed on groups of people. These ideas become codified in institutions and in the ways that we interact with one another, thus producing the inequalities we see in the world. This means that children need external explanations, such as historical injustices and racial discrimination, to understand the differences between groups that they are observing. Without context, children can mistakenly believe that racial difference is inherent, which leaves them with an inaccurate understanding of the world. More concerning, these beliefs about the inherent or essential nature of racial difference are actually a foundation of racial bias. In fact, multiple studies have found that kids with more essentialist beliefs about race, they also hold more stereotypes about other racial groups. In other words, without explicit discussions about race and the external rather than internal causes of racial disparities, children will come to the wrong conclusions and may develop racial biases. In principle, these problems could apply to any child who is not given greater context for racial differences. White children may be especially at risk because they are often least likely to have conversations about racism with their families. In fact, one of us tracked almost 1,000 parents in 2020 and found that white Americans were significantly less likely to talk to their children about race than black Americans, even after the much publicized murder of George Floyd prompted national protests and dialogue about racism. When we think about new laws limiting the discussion of race in schools, it's critical to keep in mind how they will impact children of color specifically. The research we've discussed suggests that students will be more likely to develop racially biased views in the absence of explicit lessons. Okay, hold that thought. Hold that thought. Speaking for myself, grew up middle-class family in Maryland. I did get lessons about racism, the history therein, the fires in Tulsa, 1921, all the like there. I did get lessons about all of that. I didn't get any of it laced with critical race theory. And herein lies the problem. And that's what they're not acknowledging here. Is that there is a difference between how it was taught, my generation and older, versus how it is being taught now in K through 12. And it is how it is being taught now in K through 12 that parents are objecting to. It is not. No one is objecting. To my knowledge, it is very much a straw man that the authors have stuck in here. No one is objecting to the notion that no one is objecting to teaching about racism. This is, oh goodness. This outcome is clearly at odds with the language of the laws, which explicitly state that children should not feel psychological distress because of their race, yet that is precisely what will happen if children of color face more discrimination. You don't know that, though. The research we've discussed suggests that students will be more likely to develop racially biased views in absence of explicit lessons. But nobody said we weren't getting lessons to begin with. This is the thing. Nobody said that we weren't getting lessons. As a result, children of color are likely to face more discrimination, not less. Hold it. Can you make the distinction between how we've been teaching it previously and how we're teaching it currently, and then give me that thing? Because you can't right now. There is nothing of research-wise to say if you changed how you were teaching it that kids would face more or less discrimination. Having explicit conversations with kids about racial disparities can help reduce some of the negative consequences we have described. In one study, white elementary school students who received history lessons about racial discrimination faced by African Americans had more positive views. So this is high school. Oh no, this is elementary school students. Oh, and it's only white students. Okay. Had more positive views of African Americans and were less likely to hold stereotypes than students who didn't receive such lessons. Importantly, those lessons did not lead either white or black children to hold more negative views of white Americans, which is a commonly voiced concern among those who oppose teaching about racism. Question: how was it taught? There is nothing in here that talks about how it was taught. And that is what the concern is. That is absolutely what the concern is. Early evidence from a preprint paper that when parents engage in honest conversations about race with their children, it can decrease the kids' racial biases. While laws passed in Iowa and elsewhere claim to protect kids from forming racist beliefs, the research suggests they are more likely to do the opposite. When it comes to children's understanding of racism and development of racist beliefs, the biggest danger isn't teaching or talking to children about these topics, it's staying quiet. All right, I'm gonna have to go look at this one in particular here in a little bit, but again, I noticed there is no distinction. There is no distinction, no discussion of why parents are concerned, and I will give you an example. So, this comes courtesy of Christopher Rufo, and his example, it is one of many that you can find now on the internet. Cherokee Middle School in Springfield, Missouri. Teachers who attended the program, the training began with land acknowledgement. Okay. Trainers were forced to watch a 9-minute video of George Floyd's last words. Let's see. Sullivan announced the agenda. We're going to look at 3 large concepts, and those concepts are oppression, white supremacy, and systemic racism. He and Williamson provided the teachers the handout to locate themselves on an oppression matrix, which defines white heterosexual males as a privileged social group and women, minorities, transgender, and LGBT people as oppressed social groups. Presumably, those at the top of the oppression matrix, including many of the teachers in the room, are responsible for racism, sexism, transgender oppression, heterosexism, and classism against disfavored groups. Yeah. So this is actually what people are objecting to, is things like this. Being forced. And the reason people are objecting to this is precisely the same reason those psychologists are thinking about it with kids. Because it's essentialist. This is racially essentialist stuff. This is what parents have a problem with. This is an example of why these laws have been getting passed. This is racially essentialist stuff, to presume that someone is in a privileged position because of their race, sex, gender, whatever. Or is in an oppressed position because of their race, sex, gender, whatever. Or is, somewhere in the middle. That is what people have a problem with, because you are assigning a trait to someone based upon their race, based upon their sex, based upon their sexual orientation, and that is an essentialist belief that leads to more racism, not less. And what I have noticed is that nowhere in this piece with Scientific American did the authors, let me scroll down a little bit here. Nowhere in this piece did the authors of Scientific American say anything in the differences about how racism was taught in my generation and older versus how it's being taught now. Because, like I said, I got lessons on racism in American history and what have you. I mean, there was a lot of shitty stuff that happened. Not gonna lie. But at the same time, I didn't get taught that somebody's oppressed because they're of a particular race. I didn't get taught that I'm an oppressor or that I'm privileged. That is what people are objecting to, because that is racially essentialist. No one should feel guilty because they're of a particular race or not. That's what they mean by this, because of the teachings being done with critical theory in schools are racially essentialist. And that's what annoys me with articles like this one from Scientific American, because they ignored this altogether. They ignored the reasons why, the very racial essentialist reasons why these things fail. And go back also to early on in this channel's history, the thing on, is diversity training even effective? One of the reasons it's not is because it's racially essentialist. So it should follow that if you're teaching that in school and you're teaching something racially essentialist lesson, then yeah, it's going to end badly. It's going to end badly, and there's lawsuits across the country up the wazoo right now, from different groups, and there's been all sorts of consternation. And a lot of these laws have arisen precisely because of a recognition that a bunch of the stuff like this being taught in K through 12 schools, and admittedly this has been for teachers, this one was for teachers, but it's been done with students too, be in varied forms, is itself a very, I'm sorry, you don't teach racial essentialism to correct racial essentialism. I just don't think that's going to work. So that's why I have lots of questions about this article. And never once did they make a distinction between some of the ways that things are being taught, were taught in my generation and older, which there would be a heck of a big difference versus what you're teaching now. And I suspect, frankly, I don't think a critical race theory based teaching, which is in public schools, K through 12, you can find it in the education literature. You can find it in the education literature. And if you doubt me, go over to The Reason We Learn on YouTube, because she's got plenty of it as great examples of this stuff showing up in literature, showing up in education materials. Plenty of it. She's got huge amounts of it over on her channel. Go check that out with Deb Villman. But yeah, I don't think this article is entirely honest, because it's not looking at the difference in how racism has been taught and why parents and many good teachers would object to this kind of racial essentialist nonsense being pushed on them. You don't fix this essentialism with more essentialism. So I'm disappointed in this group of psychologists, and I hope they actually end up taking a more serious look. If this is something they've been looking at, I hope they take a more serious look about how the teaching of racism has changed in K through 12 schools and whether or not it's gotten better, because I don't think so, based on the other literature about diversity trainings that use the same kind of things. And that literature has shown that they absolutely failed. That's it for now. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door if you liked the video. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian, and I hope you stay curious, everybody.